Hey everyone, this is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. Happy Friday, everybody. I hope that you had a good week, and we are going to enter the weekend by talking about the upcoming conjunction between the Sun and Saturn, which for Saturn is a death. And it is also the beginning of a new synodic cycle, which means that Saturn is about to start bringing forth a new story in our lives. What kind of story is that, especially given that shortly after the conjunction, Saturn will be entering the sign of its fall in Aries, where it will also join Neptune. This is a really significant moment, as it turns out, for Saturn transitioning. Saturn's transitions we don't often talk about. We will talk about the Sun conjoined Saturn and we'll say, oh, things will maybe be a little heavy for a few days. But we rarely start thinking about the Sun conjoined Saturn as the beginning of a new alchemical cycle, because the Sun is infusing that new cycle and its beginning point into Saturn at the time they conjoin. So we're going to look at it from that perspective today. Think about the transition that's happening shortly after into the sign of Aries, and I'm going to give you 5 things to watch for, all of that considered. So I've been trying to do a little bit more lately on the educating people on synodic cycles, because it really helps add a little bit of depth and nuance to the way we look at planets. So we'll continue on that today. Hopefully it won't be too complicated. Presenting this this kind of content outside of a classroom is a tricky challenge, because it's all about making it accessible, a little bit more like quick and easy to understand, while still not while still doing justice to the technicalities and hopefully delivering something insightful to people who are out there learning technical astrology. So it's an interesting challenge. I hope it works. We'll see. But tell me, did you learn something new from this video today? I'll be excited to hear from you guys. Before we get into it, remember to like and subscribe, share your comments and reflections. It is always great to hear from you guys. Transcripts of any of these daily talks can be found on the website, which is nightlightastrology.com. When you go over there, check out the equinox event that we have taking place this weekend. I'm going to put it up on the screen really quickly so you can see it. You go over to nightlightastrology.com. If you're in Minneapolis, St. Paul, if you're in Minnesota, or if you're in the Midwest, maybe across the border in Wisconsin or Iowa, and you desire to come and hang out with us, go to the in-person events page. You'll see the spring equinox gathering is happening Saturday evening from 6 to 8:30 p.m. We're going to get together, talk about the equinox. We're going to move and meditate, and then have some time for community sharing. So RSVP, it's free to come. We hope to see you there. Also, when you go up to events page, click on speaker series, free speaker series, the 15th, 16th, and 23rd of this month. Be sure to check those out. Fantastic, talented guest astrologers giving talks on interesting subjects. Check out the need-based astrology reading service. This has different tiered pricing points, so you can get an astrology reading that matches your budget. All of this kind of stuff has been made possible through your generosity in our annual Kickstarter campaigns. We try to make sure we give you astrology that is accessible. All right. Now, on that note, let us change our attention over to the real-time clock, and let's take a look at this upcoming death of Saturn. So I'm going to strip back everything from our perspective except for the Sun and Saturn. Now, some of this will actually be review, because Sun and Saturn synodic cycle is very similar to Sun and Mars, which we looked at yesterday. As we were taking a look at the Sun and the trine to Mars. What you'll see is today, Friday, March 17th, in the sky, the Sun is about to conjoin Saturn. Saturn's superior cycle mirrors that of Mars and Jupiter, so the patterns are the same, which means Saturn is invisible right now, combust. It's being burnt up. This was thought of by ancient astrologers as a kind of death of the planet, followed by the rebirth or resetting alchemically that the Sun provides it through the conjunction. So that conjunction comes through next week. It's going to start really on March 10th. You're going to get within about a degree. And then it's exactly on the same degree, March 11th into the 12th. And it'll just be starting to separate by the 13th. So about the middle of next week, Saturn dies. This is an important way of looking at it, because although, yes, there is a Sun conjunct Saturn moment, which we will talk about next week from the mundane perspective, meaning next week, when I talk about the Sun and Saturn, I'll just tell you what to watch for in a very basic way, like, the crystallization of creative projects is a very Sun conjoined Saturn kind of thing, where something creative takes on a shape or form that's very distinct. That can be a Sun-Saturn thing to watch for. So I'll give you that list next week. What I want to do today is talk about it from the greater alchemy of its synodic cycle. This is the reset of the Sun and Saturn. Let's go back to the last time these two planets reset. The last time that these two planets reset was right about here. This is February of 2024. So late February of 2024, I give you the exact date here. They came together on the same degree, February 28th into the 29th. Guess we had that extra day in February. So that was the last time that the two planets conjoined. Now, at that time, we could say that there was a new image that was being given to the work that Saturn is doing in our life, unique to all of the symbolism of Saturn. So things like limits, maturity, age, wisdom, exploration of polarities and dualities that Saturn represents, limits and boundaries, structure, time, maturity, discipline, etc. Also looking at things like limits and constraints that we're working with or through. The process of ignorance and illumination is a very Sun-Saturn dynamic that has been talked about for thousands of years. The Sun representing illumination, Saturn representing the dim, distant planet that can represent something like ignorance. Now, Saturn can also be quite a wise planet. It's never talked about in just one way, but the Sun-Saturn dynamic is often paired together as a way of talking about the slow, steady process of making unconscious things conscious or becoming wiser, becoming more of a veteran of life. The Sun-Saturn is about that kind of wisdom. So you look back at that cycle, it's really interesting to see that since February of 2024, we have been working with a very particular set of lessons and directions for the placement of Saturn in Pisces. Now track that out in the whole sign house of Pisces in your chart, and now you're cooking. I can trace that out very easily in my 11th house with the kinds of groups, friends, allies, and communities that have been taking shape, forming, and also the ones that I've been gradually transforming in my relationship to. This community was good. Maybe it's not quite a good fit. These friends, allies were good fits. They served a purpose. Now they're moving on. You can track it. For me, that's my 11th house, but track it in the whole sign house of Pisces since late February of 2024. And now you're on to something. So let's take a look at what's happening now. These two planets are coming together in their conjunction, which means that, again, there's going to be a death of Saturnian karma in that whole sign house of Pisces in your birth chart. The death is something like the full letting go of a cycle that has run its course. That can take a little time you may have to reflect on that a little bit, right? And look at the topics again of the whole sign house to really determine what this cycle has been about. But now we're getting a reset. So what happens is from this moment forward, Saturn will start to emerge as the morning star as the sun separates within about 15 degrees of Saturn. So here's about 15 degrees. By the end of March, we see that Saturn is newly appearing. Newly appeared Saturn, reborn, infused with new archetypal direction from the sun, means that Saturn is now carrying forth a new archetypal agenda for our lives. But what's so interesting is if we take this forward just a little bit longer, we're going to see that shortly after that infusion of the new cycle, Saturn, by the end of May, this is about May 25th, enters the sign of its fall in Aries. And then, this is important to note, we will see that there is the retrograde taking place right prior to the sun entering Leo, the trine, remember, and that trine takes place, here we go, about July, July, here we are, July 23rd. So this is a really important moment because this is where the cycle will then hit an important threshold of revision in Aries. And then it's going to toggle back into Pisces. So there's a really interesting relationship between the whole sign house of Aries and Pisces within this upcoming new cycle of Saturn. So we see the retrograde playing back into those late degrees of Pisces. And then the trine happens in the fall, where the sun in Scorpio makes the trine to Saturn in Pisces, and Saturn turns direct. Right after the trine occurs, Saturn slows down stations, turns direct. And then here's what's really fascinating. If we take this forward again, then the new cycle, the new synodic reset, occurs in March of 2026 when the sun exalted in Aries conjoins fallen Saturn in Aries. That's about a year from right now, March of 2026. So why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because this death of Saturn in Pisces takes us into a space of Aries and then a retrograde back into Pisces. I want you to think about this cycle then as planting some seeds in that whole sign house of Pisces in your birth chart. As the cycle evolves, it will carry some of those intentions into the next whole sign house of Aries, and then it will retrograde back into the whole sign house of Pisces and finish up there. And then the next cycle will fully begin in Aries. There's a really interesting dance, in other words, across the Pisces-Aries axis. Where else do we see that? Well, we see that in this month of March. We see that all over the place. We see Venus and Mercury retrograding in Aries, back into Pisces, and then back into Aries. We see the Sun coming across the North Node in Pisces, then moving for the eclipse into Aries. We see Neptune culminating in the last degrees of Pisces, moving into Aries, right? And then it will also retrograde with Saturn back into Pisces. So the Pisces-Aries cusp is being, it's like a doorway that's moving, planets are moving back and forth across. And so the simplest way of deciphering that would be to look at this, with respect to Saturn, would be to look at the space of Pisces in your birth chart, and then look at the space of Aries and think about a communication or a dialogue taking place. Let me give you an example from someone that I know. So let me just show you. I know exactly where things are going for this person who has Aries in the 10th and Pisces in the 9th. This is someone who is going to be in the process of doing basically like postgraduate research while also entering the field of their job. So think about that as the 9th house, higher education, where things are culminating and completing themselves, but there's also still further development being done in research and education, while there's also new ground being blazed with respect to their career. They're leaving school and going into the field while also continuing to do a small amount of ongoing research, sort of like a postdoctoral kind of thing. So that back and forth between the 9th and 10th is weaving the topics of the 9th and 10th together in their life. And this upcoming cycle is going to be therefore really interesting. The upcoming Saturn cycle will be all about, for example, the transition from having a lot of knowledge and wisdom and maturity and discipline and focus in the place of higher education and bringing that into the career house. And then kind of having to toggle back and forth between those two worlds. That's just a little brief example, but you should do the same thing in your birth chart. Look at the two houses and think about how there might be a conversation back and forth with Saturn's upcoming cycle. Now, here's what I want you to look for, 5 things to watch for, given that Saturn is dying and that Saturn's cycle will take it back and forth from the sign of its fall in Aries back into Pisces, and then again back into Aries, where the next synodic cycle will fully reset. So these are 5 things to watch for, given those little nuances. And the thing is that when the Sun can join Saturn, there are going to be a list of mundane things to watch for that are just very basic and everyday. We're going to cover those next week. Today, I'm thinking about this more alchemically. So it's like, think about this as a deeper seed that's being planted, the fruits of which, the process of which is not going to be automatically noticeable or visible right away, in the same way you can't see a seed beneath the soil being planted. So you have to think about this from a process-oriented perspective. So within that process-oriented perspective, 5 things to watch for. 1 is, what is the limit that you are reaching right now? It could be the limit of something's effectiveness. It could be the limit of another person or a relationship, the limit of how good you can feel about something, the limit of what you're capable of, the limit of what you're interested in, the limit of a passion or an interest, the limit of how far you can go with something. Like in business, you may have reached a limit with how productive or profitable a certain product could be at your storefront business. And so that limit is now going to inform a new cycle with respect to the development of new products. That's a limit. That's a simple Saturnian limit being reached. Think about where you're reaching a limit, a boundary, a barrier, or restriction, anything that's showing up as a point of expiration or a boundary or a limit somehow. The limit is meaningful. And the limit that's being reached is also going to be integral to defining the new direction that Saturn will bring forth. Because Saturn brings us to limits only to announce the tension between what's on one side of the limit and the other. And that tension can be very creative with Saturn. So just keep that in mind. Number 2 would be a state of polarization and critical mass. If you are sort of reaching a place where you're starting to notice there's a polarity between me and a value, a philosophy, an ideal, a belief, something that I hold as important, and there's something or someone that is at odds with it, you may notice that any kind of polarization is reaching critical mass, which means a decision has to be made. A mediation, a solution, a negotiation has to be reached, or a departure has to be made. You have to make a clean cut and say, I have to go this way, not that way. The presence of such hard polarities is very normal for the reset of a Saturn cycle, that it is those states of polarity that occur that will refine or redirect the direction that Saturn is taking, because Saturn is about what we are committed to, and that will often present as hard choices between things that are polarized. I can do this, I can't do that. So think about the state of polarization and critical mass informing the creative direction that you're heading in. No one thinks about Saturn as creative, but it's a highly creative planet. It just works through the tensions of polarities and dualities in a way that is often, uncomfortable. But we also mature and grow wiser by learning how to hold these tensions, make mature, discerning decisions, and so forth. Number 3 would be a no that leads to a yes. Wherever you feel like you have to say no to something, you have to limit something, say no, no more, not this, not that. Neti neti, that's the path in Indian philosophy. Neti neti means you get closer to truth by very clearly seeing what isn't true. That's not true. That's not true. That's not true for me. This isn't right for me. That's not right for me. That neti neti, that no, the via negativa. It's a way forward that is clarified by what you very clearly don't want or can't do or can't say yes to. So think about that as clarifying itself. The no may be clear, maybe the yes isn't, but it will come in time as Saturn's cycle is resetting. Number 4 is a death and a crossing of a threshold. Look, when the sun conjoins Saturn, sometimes there are literal deaths. Oftentimes, again, we have the death of a solar figure involved in such moments. But it can also be a moment in which archetypal images and ideals are being reset, just like an eclipse of the sun. Sun and Saturn have a lot in common to a solar eclipse in the sense that the sense of purpose and ambition and direction can die. It's almost as if rather than thinking of Saturn being reset by the sun, we're thinking of the sun being a sense of clear light and purpose being killed by Saturn. You can kind of read it that way too, but either way, the sun then infuses Saturn with renewed sense of purpose or a new clarity or new direction, the kind of sunrise that comes after the dark night of the soul. But it can be a little dark night of the soul where there is a death of some kind. Usually it's figurative and metaphorical. And then the reason that I put this one at the end is because I suspect that this next Saturn cycle is going to be a very difficult one, as will the next Saturn cycle, synodic cycle. The reason I say that is because dancing across the threshold between Pisces and Aries is about trying to radically redirect something in our lives. Aries really likes to start new things, but it is the exaltation of the sun and the fall of Saturn, which means that the kinds of things that Saturn is going to bring forth in the next cycle are going to require a very difficult and very deep, kind of hard-working process that will probably entail dealing with or meeting a lot of frustrations, dealing with things like the feeling of impotency or ineffectiveness, having to remain persevering, courageous, persistent, despite what feels like real obstacles to growth that will happen when Saturn is in Aries. And yet the heroic path outlined by this dance between Pisces and Aries is about wrestling light from darkness. And so I suspect it will be an incredibly glorious cycle, but it's kind of dramatic. So you think about this death as leading to a very deep and difficult process of individuation, of rebirth, of sort of fighting through a difficult period as new things are established. There's something very solo and inward and internal and individual about the next Saturn cycle that each of us will have to, maybe do some inner battling. And so I suspect that because of the dignity of Saturn, that's part of this cycle in Aries, along with Neptune as well. So we'll be talking more about Saturn and Neptune's conjunction and what to think about given those two planets coming together as well. But for now, I hope that this journey into the alchemy of Saturn has been interesting in its synodic cycle. Like I said, next week, I'll take a look at Sun conjoined Saturn from a more mundane perspective. So we've delved into synodic cycles this week, and I hope it's been useful for you. But tell me how, if it was too technical, like I'd love that feedback so that when I teach it in future daily content episodes, I can kind of gauge if you're getting something good from it or not. And on that note, I hope you have a great weekend. Take it easy, everyone. Bye.